Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the panel on external relations. It's going to be a great panel today, so we're looking forward to it. And since I don't have a lot to say on this topic, I'm going to let us get started. So our first speaker is going to be, we've had a change in order, but Mr. Yuri González Hernández. Mr. González Hernández is a Cuban lawyer from the University of Havana, who is currently in residence at Penn State, where he is working on his LLM degree. Or I think he's got his LLM degree, hasn't he?
Yep.
Right. I read that somewhere. Before his arrival at Penn State, Mr. González Hernández worked as a legal advisor for different Cuban companies and the tax office of the historian of the city of Havana. Oh, I would have liked that job. That would have been interesting. My daughter-in-law is a tax lawyer. Since 2016, he has provided legal advice to self-employed workers, and also has participated in nonprofit entrepreneurial projects aimed at development of some of the communities of the city of Havana. So at that, I will turn it over to Yuri, who's going to be speaking on Follow the Yellow Brick Road, Cuba and China's Belt and Road Initiative. Yuri, it's yours.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. This afternoon, I'm gonna be presenting a little bit about the relationship between Cuba and China. It's part of the work that I have been doing with the professor Larry Catá-Backer at Penn State. So I'm gonna present in Spanish, but the PowerPoint is gonna be in English. So let me share my screen. Okay. Okay. Well, las relaciones comerciales entre Cuba y China han tenido un largo proceso, el cual se ha visto marcado luego de la década de los 60. Pero se han visto reforzadas entre los 80 y ya realmente han evolucionado luego del periodo especial en el cual Cuba estuvo marcado por diferentes cambios económicos, los cuales lo obligaron a buscar otros socios comerciales en aras de mejorar en el ámbito económico. Entonces, esto se dio debido a que Cuba tenía una gran dependencia económica por ser parte del campo de la Unión de Países Socialistas, el cual se diluyó precisamente en la década de los 90, y entonces es cuando tiene que abrirse paso a la introducción del capital extranjero, lo cual, no con la intención de hacerlo plenamente, recurre a China como socio en este sentido. Cuba, para ser un país con un programa político en función de obras sociales, se planteó la asistencia económica, la asistencia en materia económica, pero bien basada en la colaboración, centradas en los sectores de la salud y la educación principalmente. También comenzó a elaborar estrategias para lograr un comercio que impulsara su economía. China, luego de su despegue económico, comenzó a abrirse paso en los mercados de América Latina y el Caribe mediante el fortalecimiento de los lazos con las relaciones bilaterales. En este caso, con Cuba, vino a ser de gran importancia, dado a la actualidad China es el segundo socio comercial de Cuba, y Cuba pasó a ser el primer socio comercial de China en el Caribe. China estuvo exportando principalmente productos mecánicos y eléctricos como refrigeradores, autobuses y motores a Cuba, y estuvo importando de Cuba productos como el níquel, azúcar y ocupación agrícola y auxiliar entre otro tipo de servicios, cual recibe de Cuba. Cuba y China han estado firmando sucesivamente acuerdos y convenios, convenios y tratados que respetan el comercio, la ciencia y la tecnología. Además, han firmado otros acuerdos como la cooperación económica y comercial, la aplicación de visados mutuos y la protección de las inversiones, el turismo y entre otros. Dentro de los principales acuerdos que podemos ver, ahí les doy aproximadamente una cronología de los principales acuerdos que se han firmado desde que comenzó el fortalecimiento como tal de las relaciones comerciales entre Cuba y China. Ahí tenemos acuerdos como el convenio sobre la cooperación científica y tecnológica, el convenio sobre la cooperación económica, el acuerdo de cooperación turística que comenzó en el año 92, como muchos saben, en el año 92 Cuba comenzó a abrirse paso como tal en el turismo y empezó a desarrollar como una actividad económica reconocida en el país. A partir del 95 comienza a promover y a proteger la inversión extranjera, utilizando a Cuba como uno de los principales socios comerciales. Ya en el 99 entran los dos gobiernos en un tipo de convenio comercial a nivel gubernamental. Y Cuba y China firman un acuerdo bilateral, lo cual envuelve la Organización Mundial del Comercio. Está involucrada en este sentido. Ahí les muestro otros acuerdos importantes para los dos países, tales como los acuerdos en el reconocimiento mutuo de los diplomas y certificados académicos de los sistemas de enseñanza tanto de China como de Cuba. Acuerdos que se mantienen aún en vigencia están el acuerdo de préstamo de crédito al comprador general entre los dos gobiernos. Aquí lo que se estaba queriendo era reforzar el desarrollo de un parque eólico para darle otro tipo de fuente energética a Cuba. Este acuerdo, aunque todavía el proyecto está en marcha, es un acuerdo que se mantiene en vigor. Otro acuerdo es el del préstamo al comprador general entre el gobierno de la República de Cuba y el Banco de Exportación de China. Otro de los acuerdos es el préstamo para créditos preferenciales al comprador y el gobierno de la República de Cuba y el Banco de Exportación de China, así como el préstamo para créditos preferenciales al comprador entre los dos y el Banco de Importación y Exportación de China. Dentro de la amplia gama de proyectos de desarrollo de la República de China en los que Cuba se ha unido, abarca el sector de desarrollo tecnológico. Otro acuerdo propuesto es el que las universidades de Cuba y China trabajan en colaboración para crear un instituto internacional de inteligencia artificial. Para el desarrollo de este proyecto, académicos y científicos cubanos trabajan en este proyecto con la Universidad de Estudios Internacionales de Hebei en China. Cuba también ha estado estableciendo acuerdos en el ámbito de la biotecnología. Los documentos incluyen, en sentido general, la cooperación entre la Zona de Desarrollo Tecnológico de Yongsu en la República de China y Biocuba Pharma en Cuba. Esto lo que pretende es que se firme el acuerdo de licencia de patente de tecnología para el producto Nasbac. O sea que es un producto que van a desarrollar entre ambas instituciones con el objetivo de desarrollar productos que involucren la genética y la biotecnología. También se firma este acuerdo basado en el desarrollo del Centro de Investigación Biotecnológica de Changchun para unirlo con el Departamento de Inmunología Molecular de Cuba. Estos se han propuesto constituirla en la zona de desarrollo del Mariel. Estos son otros acuerdos firmados en Beijing, los cuales todavía están en vigor. Aquí generalmente aquí se pone como objetivo principal el sector turístico, que muestra potencial porque las dos partes están interesadas en este destino turístico en el Caribe, para lo cual Cuba firmó un memorándum con una de las más grandes compañías que tiene China, las grandes compañías turísticas, es C-Trip, que es la segunda agencia de viajes más grande del mundo, para posicionar sus destinos turísticos en Cuba. Este sitio va a promover los atractivos de Cuba en China, pero además su firma tendrá contactos con el fin de fortalecer aún más las relaciones que tiene como objetivo duplicar en algunos años el número de viajeros de China hacia Cuba. Ahora, como todos sabemos, por el tema del COVID, eso se verá un poco más difícil, pero esa era la intención. En noviembre de 2018, China le da a Cuba la bienvenida al programa de la nueva ruta de la seda. En este proyecto, lo que se prevé es ampliar las inversiones y los planes de otras empresas bajo los principios del mercado internacional, para lo cual se firmaron otros acuerdos, los cuales les muestro aquí. Estos acuerdos que se firmaron en Beijing, lo que pretenden es asumir un poco más lo que ellos firmaron en el plan de acción que firmaron en el año 2019, China y Cuba, que es un instrumento que abarca acciones estratégicas para fortalecer las relaciones entre los dos países, así como el intercambio continuo de misiones en fin de fortalecer la cooperación. Entonces, en el año 2018 se firma además un memorándum de entendimiento para el Centro de Promoción del Comercio Exterior y la Inversión Extranjera en Cuba y el Consejo Chino para la Promoción del Comercio Internacional. Este plan lo que quiere es asumir este desarrollo, pero además lo incluyen en algo que ellos llaman plan de consultas políticas entre los dos ministerios para el desarrollo, en este caso, de estos convenios. Otra de los convenios que se ha firmado es que Cuba y China han creado una empresa mixta. Desde el 25 de enero al año pasado, la planta mixta Changerberg, ubicada en la aldea de Changchun, ha estado preparando un medicamento que es uno de los 30 elegidos por la Comisión Nacional de Salud de China por su potencial para curar afecciones respiratorias, lo cual se aplica en pacientes en China que han sido tratados precisamente por el COVID. Esta también es una terapia eficaz para el cáncer, lo cual unido con Biotech y Changchun Herbert Biological Technology son el resultado de esta cooperación. Esto es otra fase que quieren aplicar los dos países para unirlo, en este caso, al desarrollo de la ruta de la seda. Y como último dato que les quería dar es que China y Cuba han estado colaborando también desde el punto de vista del desarrollo de las universidades. Entonces, la Universidad de Estudios Internacionales de GBI ha fortalecido las relaciones con los centros homólogos en Cuba para la constitución y la construcción de estudios e incluso crear un proyecto conjunto con el Instituto de Ciencias Médicas y las universidades de Carlos J. Finlay en Camagüey, Mariana Grajales en Holguín y la Escuela Latinoamericana de Medicina. Ellos lo que pretenden es crear vínculos entre estos centros y y crear servicios para ambos países. Entonces, esto es parte de lo que hemos estado viendo hasta ahora entre los dos países, que puede ser parte de esta nueva iniciativa de China al unirla a la nueva ruta de seda. Entonces, hasta aquí son los datos que tenía para mostrarles. Si tienen alguna pregunta.
We will do the preguntas at the end. None have come up yet in any event. Okay, so our next guest, who we had at our conference 6 months ago, Vadim Grishim, who will be speaking on a point of no return, the ongoing Cuban crisis in an historical framework. That is an interesting title. Vadim is a PhD in social science and an MBA from Georgetown University. After the collapse of the USSR, Dr. Grishim was involved in the reform process in Russia, serving as an advisor to the Deputy Prime Minister of the Russian Federation from 92 to 93 and 2006 to 2009. He was there at the creation. Dr. Grishim has extensive experience working with the Bretton Woods institutions. He serves as senior advisor at the International Monetary Fund and has taught courses on the economics of transition at Georgetown University and the George Washington University. If I were still living in Washington, I'd be coming to your classes. So with that note, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Grishim. Vadim.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gary, for this kind introduction. Yes, the topic is interesting, but very complicated, a point of no return. In December of 1991, almost 30 years ago, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. It was an unexpected historical event that has still had a significant impact on the development of many countries around the world, including Cuba. The remarkable jubilee has stimulated reflections on the legacy and experience of the post-communist transition in Central and Eastern Europe, CEE, and Eurasia, and on their relevance for the current situation unfolding in Cuba, a former Soviet satellite that splintered from the deceased Soviet Empire. There is a prevailing opinion that the CEE, Central and Eastern Europe countries, as well as the Eurasian states, have mostly completed their post-communist transformation. Their results have been quite mixed. Several of them have formed modern democracies with market economies. Some have turned to soft informational authoritarianism and have increased administrative controls over their economies, while other post-Soviet republics, including Russia, have slipped back into tougher authoritarian rule, allowing for state monopolies to play a dominant role in strategic industries in the process developing system of organized corruption. Cuba seems to have become frozen in this background and is still inching forward with traditional socialist economic cycles, maintaining an old-fashioned repressive political regime. Practically all former socialist countries before deep structural changes have passed through a so-called socialist investment or economic cycle. The standard first step of this cycle is to introduce liberalizing measures as a reaction to slow growth rates or economic crisis. The second is to implement policies that boost economic growth. And the third step is to prevent intensification of macroeconomic imbalances. In its efforts to modernize and update an exhausted socialist economic model, Cuba has been passing through the initial stage of that cycle, facing challenges when it becomes impossible to maintain stability in an economic structure that has not been strengthened with additional reforms. On the whole, these measures have coincided with fundamental elements of Gorbachev economic reforms, which attempt to increase the autonomy of socialist enterprises by converting them to self-financing and self-managing entities, to develop individual and cooperative forms of ownership, to attract foreign capital through joint ventures, as well as unify exchange rates. The differences between these approaches and Cuba's are evident. The island has been moving much more slowly and cautiously, while, as we know, Gorbachev's economic team failed to implement responsible macroeconomic policy and to adopt unpopular but necessary economic decisions, particularly price and tax reforms. Cuba is still between, again, the first and second stages of a socialist economic cycle, and its private sector contribution to GDP is below that of the under-reformed countries in the former Soviet socialist bloc, such as Turkmenistan or Belarus. Reforms in an authoritarian socialist system, as a rule, have been very difficult to break and have taken place because of two main factors: a shift in political leadership and a meaningful change at the economic level. In the past, cyclical economic development was observed in most socialist countries, which including growing economic difficulties and inability to do business as usual because of an exhaustion of extensive mobilization activities, which prompt these countries to start modernization reforms using market components that, as a rule, contributed to soaring inflation and public debt and resulted in reform rollbacks and partial return to the standards of a common economy. Such reformist cycles took place in the Soviet Union during the Khrushchev thaw in the late 50s and early 60s, then during a period of so-called Kosygin reforms in the mid-60s, and finally during Gorbachev perestroika at the end of the 80s. According to available information, Cuba now seems to be drawn into the third reformist cycle. The first one in that country was triggered by the collapse of the Soviet Empire and was quickly phased out in 1995. Opinions vary as to why the attempt at reform after the collapse of the Soviet Union was scrapped in Cuba. There is talk of Fidel Castro's rigid views, his harsh anti-Americanism, and the Cuban leadership realization that they would not be able to contain the situation if a Cuban Tiananmen occurred. This, of course, cannot be ruled out, but there is another important circumstance. Any transformation, whether it's in the Eastern Europe version, Eurasian, in the former Soviet Union, or in China or Vietnam, involves not only the creation of market mechanism, but also the inclusion of these countries in the global economy. The presence of an economically powerful and politically influential Cuban community near the island in the United States certainly intimidates Havana. There is an understanding there that the current communist elite would lose virtually all of its position if such active integration were to take place with the inevitable involvement of Cuban Americans. In this case, the effect of a divided nation probably also works. From this point of view, the Cuban situation can be seen through the prism of the unification of Germany of the unification of Northern and Southern Vietnam, as well as through the prism of a divided Korea. In the case of Cuba, there is no divided territory, but there is a divided nation. By the way, the unification of Germany and the situation with the two Koreas was mentioned during discussion in the first session, but was viewed from a different angle: the effectiveness of market institutions and the difference in the development of divided nations. There is certainly an interesting theoretical angle, but in practical terms, it seems what communist elites care about what may happen to them in the case of integration. There are more concerns not with development, but with their own survival. The second cycle in 2008-2011 was initiated by a partial change in political leadership, with the gradual departure of Fidel Castro from power and the growing influence of his brother Raúl, as well as by pressure brought on during the global financial turmoil at the time. As for the second stage of reforms initiated by Raúl Castro, attract attention recent statements made by a close friend of Raúl, former Lieutenant General of the Soviet KGB, Nikolai Leonov. He is 82 years old now. He sees the value of the second cycle of reform initiated by Raúl primarily in terms of the continuity of power, the rejuvenation of leadership, and the change of leaders. According to Leonov, this will allow Cuba to avoid the Belarusian scenario. In general, it should be noted that one of the main issues of socialist-type authoritarianism is the leadership turnover. In the Soviet Union, leadership changes occurred mostly, let's put it in this way, by anthropological reasons, as a result of dearth of communist leaders. Lenin, Stalin, Brezhnev, or Andropov. Only once there was a bureaucratic coup against Khrushchev, and we remember that Gorbachev left his position as a result of the collapse of the whole system. The current third cycle is linked to a further restructuring of the political hierarchy in Havana, to the implementation of some provisions of a new constitution, and to a deep economic crisis induced by the dramatic reduction of subsidies from Venezuela and the belated arrival of COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has exposed the vulnerability of the Cuban economy, and attempt to compensate for the loss of Venezuela's assistance through the development of tourism services has proven to be non-sustainable. Decreasing US remittances and raised sanctions have also added pain to the existing economic reality. The country has found itself between a rock and hard place, and once again, an ongoing crisis has prompted a new set of reforms. Paradoxically, after the 1959 revolution, Cuba turned out to be an oil-dependent country. During the Soviet period, a scheme oil in exchange for sugar was based on significant subvention and lasted for almost 30 years. In the early 2000s, reforms were pushed back by substantial subsidies from Venezuela. Involving parallels with the USSR occurred as well at the end of the 60s, when Kosygин's reforms were abandoned as a result of huge oil fields discovered in Western Siberia. Cuba, a country without significant oil reserves, turned into a kind of petrostate, critically dependent on oil delivery and distribution of oil revenues, first from the USSR and then from Venezuela. That bonanza period now seems to have come to an end. Reforms pose serious challenges to a socialist regime. Cuba is slowly moving towards high risk and long delayed exchange rate unification, with its government preparing to scrap the dollar-backed convertible peso and devalue the regular Cuban peso. It was an interesting discussion during the first session today about this. This step will be essentially to advancing the island's economic reform agenda. But it promises to be a delicate one, as it puts pressure on inefficient state companies while threatening savings and creating inflation dynamics that will be difficult to control. timing the arrival of a pandemic with the implementation of reforms was not chosen by chance. It has allowed the government to reduce the risk of major social protests. There are always winners and losers in any reform program. But when it comes to currency unification, the major loser could be an incipient private sector that have been weakened by the collapse of the tourist season 2020-2021, while public companies could likely receive compensation from the state. Generally here, the Cuban leadership faces a dilemma again, determining what reform path it should take. The Sino-Vietnamese model that maintains social rhetoric, strict censorship, mechanism of repression, and a one-party political system has long attracted sympathy in Havana. At the same time, it's obvious that the Sino-Vietnamese model, with the two-track economic transformation, applying quick decollectivization in agriculture and creation of efficient special economic zones that facilitate a shift to export orientation and intensive integration with global value chains, have become hardly acceptable to the Cuban leadership. By comparison, the Eastern European post-communist model that included both a political component with democratization of political life and an economic one with full liberalization of market forces and various forms of European integration into NATO and the EU, do not readily conform to the Cuban reality. There are also models that have been tested in post-Soviet republics, but for different reasons, they have lost their attractiveness in Cuba. The relatively stable and deeply under-reformed Belarusian authoritarian regime that has aroused certain sympathies in Havana has now begun to fall apart in the eyes of the world. A visible constraint that is presently getting in the way of Cuban reforms is the unwillingness on the part of the island's authorities to use the investment capacity of the Cuban community abroad. Core ethnic communities have provided a meaningful chunk of investment capital that has worked very efficiently during the initial stages of reforms in different countries like Poland, China, Baltic republics, and Vietnam. Of course, at this time, there is a sanctions barrier blocking sizable FDIs to Cuba, and even small-scale investment that could potentially emerge from a multi-billion flow of remittances are being drastically restricted, de facto rejected by official Havana. The very significant scale of Cuban immigration, primarily to the US, has also created the effect of divided nation, as I talked already. This is not a replica of the situation that took place in Eastern and West Germany, or what is taking place now in the North or South Koreas. Nevertheless, future reintegration of a part of the Cuban American community into the island's life seems inevitable. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, such reintegration of so-called white immigrants never occurred in Russia because long years had passed since the Bolshevik Revolution and several generations change of Russian migration transpired. In countries where the duration of socialist regimes was relatively short, however, as in the CE area, for example, partial reintegration of immigrants was successful. But at present, such prospects are perceived by Havana as a threat. From that point of view, systemic anti-American rhetoric on the part of Cuba's government is not only a form of nationalism or mechanism for distancing itself from powerful northern neighbors in the interest of a ruling communist elite, but also as an instrument for limiting the influence of the Cuban American community on the island. Anti-Americanism remains an important pillar of the current Cuban regime. In turn, the communist Cuban theme has long remained a part of the US domestic political agenda. The current arrival of a new democratic administration promises a US policy pivot towards Cuba. Whether that proves to be a turn from Trump era to Obama II era, with the new reset and detent will depend on many unpredictable factors. Obviously, part of the Cuban elite is continuing on that development as a favorable anti-crisis strategy, while at the same time fearing the process, remembering that the short thaw between Havana and Washington, which happened at the end of the second term of Obama administration, was accompanied by unprecedented growth in the popularity of the American president among the Cuban population. An erosion of condensed anti-Americanism could open prospects for deeper structural reforms in the island and remove some restrictive blocks that are in the way of creating a market economy. This is exactly what occurred in a majority of socialist countries during Gorbachev's perestroika period, when for a while President Reagan and British Prime Minister Thatcher became more popular in those countries than most local communist leaders there. It was a turning point, a point of no return. Let me stop here, and I will be glad to participate in our further discussion. Thank you very much.
Sorry, everybody, my mouse would not respond. Okay, so great. And Vadim, excellent. I love your perspectives. And you've had so much experience, it's just wonderful. Our next speaker is Armando Chaguaceda? Did I get it? Good, okay. Good for me. Armando. He's a doctor of history and regional studies, a researcher in government and political analysis, member of the National System of Researchers of the National Council of Science and Technology in Mexico. Level 1. I'm not quite sure what level 1 means, but in any event. He has been research professor at the Higher Pedagogical Institute at the University of Havana, the College of Veracruz, Universidad Veracruzana, Universidad Iberoamericana, and the Universidad de Guanajuato. He's been visiting professor at the Polytechnic University of Nicaragua. I've been to all these countries. The Central University of Venezuela, the University of Gerona, I haven't done that one, and of course the Sorbonne. He has specialized in the study of the process of democratization and autocratization? I'm not even sure how to pronounce that in English. As well as in the state-civil society relationship, with special attention to the areas of Cuba, Mexico, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. He has studied political processes in post-Soviet Russia, as well as geopolitical links with Latin America. He has attended academic conferences in Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica, Chile, Cuba, Ecuador, Spain, France, Mexico, Nicaragua, Peru, Dominican Republic, United States, Uruguay, and Venezuela. I would love to see your passport and all the visas. And he's an author of 6 books and 30 academic articles. I think that's a pretty impressive resume. At that, however, I'm going to let you pass on to your topic, which is Poder Incisivo. I'm going to let you pronounce your title.
Sí, yeah. Poder, sharp power, poder incisivo, sharp power.
Okay, go ahead.
Bueno, voy a compartir, vamos a compartir acá la pantalla, por favor. ¿Me apoyas por acá, por favor? Estoy con problemas con compartir la pantalla. Sí. A ver.
¿Dónde está tu PowerPoint?
Bueno,
Si esa se cuadra de bien.
creo que pueden ver, ¿verdad? Si me confirman de audio, por favor, porque estoy con la... Sí, perfecto. Bueno, muchas gracias, en particular a Jorge Pérez López, Silvia Pedraza, los amigos, las amigas que me han invitado acá. Veo a otras personas que son muy caras siempre. Por ahí está Ivonne Grenier, está William Leogrande, es decir, muchos amigos, Andrés, Hernández también. Y bueno, por supuesto, mis colegas del panel. Creo que es la presentación en estos tiempos de pandemia que ha tenido más público. Veo más de 50 personas conectadas, lo cual es, wow, mucho público. Y trataremos de sintetizar lo que es una investigación en proceso desde hace 2 años, que comenzó sobre el fenómeno y la noción del sharp power o poder incisivo. Después vamos a hablar de qué se trata, pero después se ha ido articulando con otras nociones más, digamos, más nuevas que hemos ido incorporando, como la de tecnología o tecnólogos políticos, y cómo esto se articula en el fenómeno de fondo de la presencia de la agenda del Estado cubano dentro de la academia latinoamericanista, o sea, no solo latinoamericana, sino latinoamericanista. Mi presentación está en inglés, pero de manera que va a facilitar que la puedan leer, pero voy a hablar en castellano. Y quiero comenzar con esta frase de un intelectual muy reconocido, Edward Said, que ustedes conocen bien, que remite al rol del intelectual. El intelectual definido como noción desde el famoso affair Dreyfus en el siglo XIX, pero que ha transitado en el último siglo por una azarosa existencia en las disputas geopolíticas e ideológicas de la era contemporánea. Y Edward Said nos plantea acá el tema de la lucha por la autonomía intelectual, más allá del origen nacional, del vínculo estatal e institucional, y la búsqueda de una relativa independencia de los intelectuales frente a todo tipo de autoridad. Es obvio decir que Edward Said, además, es muy reconocido dentro de la academia norteamericana, tanto progresista como liberal, y estas frases me parecen muy importantes para abrir lo que quiero decir, para captar la esencia del asunto. Bueno, los 3 issues, los 3 momentos de mi presentación, si tengo tiempo de desarrollarlo, después, al final, tendrán algunas referencias que podrán leer para ahondar en esto. Son, bueno, primero voy a presentar algunos conceptos y tópicos sobre los cuales sostengo mi perspectiva, sobre todo de sharp power, tecnólogos políticos y el fenómeno más clásico, tradicional de control ideológico. Cada uno de estos fenómenos, conceptos, remite a una dimensión espacial de proyección de la agenda estatal. En segundo momento pondré algunos ejemplos, porque esto es algo que ha sido objeto de mucho ensayo, mucho debate, pero muy pocas veces se le pone datos, se les pone número, de la presencia en un espacio concreto, del cual, por cierto, muchas y muchos de los que estamos acá formamos parte, ¿verdad? Que son asociaciones latinoamericanistas, es decir, no solo latinoamericanas, sino que estudian América Latina, y en la cual al menos yo detecto varios procesos que se dan. Una presencia simétrica en relación con los recursos humanos y el peso específico de la isla y de su academia, ciertas afinidades ideológicas que conectan la agenda del Estado cubano con esas grandes asociaciones, especialmente con sus directivas, ciertas narrativas hegemónicas dentro del campo intelectual de la izquierda americana, incluyendo en esto aparte la izquierda norteamericana, y formas muy concretas de poder de veto basadas en la participación de estas grandes representaciones de la agenda y de la academia oficial dentro de estas organizaciones. Y por último, y creo que sería lo más rico de esta discusión, la coexistencia de nuevos escenarios con viejas prácticas. Voy con el primer punto, ¿no? Bueno, primero, todos sabidos que se ha desarrollado mucho la noción de sharp power. Jessica Ludwig y Christopher Walker lo han desarrollado desde hace aproximadamente 5 o 6 años en un texto seminal en el Journal of Democracy, pero después ha sido objeto de muchas investigaciones. Y esto recupera un poco la discusión de Joseph Nye sobre un poder blando, pero en este caso se hablaba de la forma específica en que autocracias utilizan las instituciones, las comunicaciones, los tipos de lazos que la globalización abre, que no existían en la Guerra Fría de manera clara, para influir la opinión pública y las sociedades y las academias de las naciones democráticas a través de tácticas de seducción, distracción, manipulación. Y un factor y un actor clave en esto son los intelectuales, en tanto los intelectuales tienen dos características muy importantes. Uno son productores y multiplicadores de ideas, y en una sociedad abierta estas ideas llegan a través de los más media a muchos públicos, pero también a través de la influencia de think tanks y de espacios específicamente intelectuales. Y otra característica muy clara en el siglo XX, que hay una contraposición entre intelectuales autocráticos, diría Mark Lilla, este intelectual norteamericano filotiránico de derecha y de izquierda, y intelectuales comprometidos con la idea de deliberación, pluralismo, sociedad abierta, ciudadanía activa, es decir, intelectuales democráticos. Bueno, el Chart Power lo que hace es aprovechar o trasladarse o expresarse a través de ciertas ideas, ciertas figuras y ciertas redes intelectuales contra las sociedades abiertas, la academia libre, autónoma y la democracia política. Un segundo concepto es el concepto de tecnólogos políticos, que ha sido desarrollado también, bueno, en el campo de estudios postsoviético. Gleb Pavlovsky y un grupo de autores los ha trabajado, pero el último libro de Iván Krastev y Stephen Holmes, La luz que agoniza, desarrolla muy bien este ejemplo. ¿Y qué cosas son los tecnólogos políticos? ¿Qué sería tecnología política? Bueno, algo de lo cual, por cierto, para el caso cubano, el intelectual canadiense Yvon Grenier ha sido precursor en sus análisis, que es la idea del arte de producir apariencias o maquillaje, el arte de fingir. Y es la idea de que dentro de ciertos regímenes autoritarios, junto con los mecanismos tradicionales, ¿verdad?, de control ideológico, fronteras adentro, se produce la aparición de unos ciertos espacios que pueden ser gongos, o sea, ONGs gubernamentales, espacios de debate autorizados, intelectuales leales, que usan una retórica y unos procesos de apariencia democrática, sistemas de discusión, retórica de discusión, objetos de discusión, pero que terminan fortaleciendo el control del Estado autoritario. Es decir, la idea de crear una realidad, dicen Krastev y Holmes, un trabajo creativo en ciertas coyunturas críticas, pueden ser crisis políticas, emergencia de protestas ciudadanas, cambios de modelos económicos, y en esas coyunturas críticas los tecnólogos políticos construyen una realidad paralela, alterna, que no remite a los fenómenos estructurales de poder y que se articula con lo que Fronteras Exterior se hace con Chart Power, porque parte de los tecnólogos políticos también participan en los procesos de proyección del Chart Power. Y la tecnología política se dirige sobre todo a seducir segmentos de las élites nativas conectadas, pero sobre todo audiencias foráneas, al tiempo que la ideología oficial tradicional de control, de censura, se orienta a través de la masa de la población que es cautiva de los medios tradicionales de información y propaganda. Bueno, lo que planteo en esta investigación, que es más larga, es que Chart Power y tecnología política son los correlatos externos y in between, intermedio, de lo que es el tradicional control ideológico del Estado cubano fronteras adentro sobre la producción y diseminación de las ciencias sociales. Como es por todas y todos conocido, hay estructuralmente hablando en el modelo cubano una lógica de control de la autonomía de la universidad, de la autonomía del campo científico, que permea diferentes formas de producción y difusión de ideas, y que, y aquí pongo una cita de hecho de un intelectual, de un académico, incluso funcionario oficial, publicada en una revista autorizada en la isla, donde se plantea un poco la existencia de este fenómeno de voluntarismo, de improvisación y de limitación del debate, ¿no? Y lo quise traer como una cita porque me parece interesante como una especie de reflejo de este fenómeno, ¿no? Acá solamente grafico, ustedes conocen a Vadim. Vadim es un proyecto transnacional de medición de la democracia, pero no solo en dimensión poliárquica, es mucho más amplio, más rico. Yo soy parte del equipo de expertos de Vadim para dos países concretos, Cuba y Venezuela, y lo que traté es de graficar, la evolución de la libertad académica y cultural, que es muy bueno que se midan juntos en este caso, de 5 países de América Latina, y bueno, el caso cubano, desde los años 80, en el cual varios de estos países transitan de regímenes autoritarios de derecha a democracias liberales, de diferente calidad. Bueno, cómo se mantiene en algunos casos en general hay una mejora del ambiente de libertad académica y cultural, pero en Cuba se mantiene básicamente estable, ¿no? Bueno, voy al segundo punto de la presentación en aras de avanzar. Lo que queremos ver es que a partir del estudio que hemos hecho ya, hemos visto, y además es creo que de todas y de todos conocido, una presencia importante de la agenda, las instituciones y el personal académico más vinculado al Estado cubano en las dos grandes asociaciones latinoamericanistas. Esto, por supuesto, aprovecha los tradicionales vínculos que ha tenido el Estado cubano con las izquierdas regionales, pero también aprovecha ciertos elementos de afinidades ideológicas y electivas del campo intelectual de América Latina y Estados Unidos, que es buena parte de izquierdas, con agendas del Estado cubano. La filósofa política Claudia Hill, en un texto que yo les recomiendo mucho siempre, Silencio Cuba, la izquierda democrática frente al régimen de la Revolución Cubana, ha analizado, usando la obra de Claude Lefort, el porqué de estas afinidades, ¿no? Y sobre todo la idea de que pueda haber cierto reconocimiento de avances innegables de los primeros años de la revolución en materia social que justificarían la inexistencia o la vulneración de los derechos de discusión, investigación y difusión de lo investigado, que son reglas comunes en el resto de la academia en la que todas y todos vivimos, ¿no? Acá voy a mencionar solamente algunos ejemplos porque me parece que los números ilustran. Según datos oficiales del ASA, Latin American Studies Association, la sección cubana en el 2019 era la sección con más miembros, superior incluso a México y Brasil juntos. De manera que tenemos un país que ni por tamaño del PIB, ni por cantidad de instituciones académicas, ni por fortaleza de la academia puede competir con México y Brasil. Sin embargo, tiene una enorme presencia de miembros. Obviamente, parte de estos miembros son miembros también que residen en el exterior, pero buena parte de estos miembros también están afiliados a las instituciones oficiales cubanas, dentro de las cuales hay diversas posiciones también, hay diferentes grados de desarrollo de las disciplinas, unas más avanzadas que otras, hay trabajos meritorios, algunos de los cuales se presentan en estas conferencias, pero que en general se mantiene la idea, por ejemplo, de una delegación, es decir, cuando se proyecta la agenda de la Academia Estatal Cubana, que es la oficialmente reconocida, se proyecta con la envoltura de que hay una delegación. Y esa delegación va con ciertas orientaciones, contenido, temas de discusión y se proyectan en el Congreso. Vean cómo, de una manera, una representación tan grande de un país y una academia tan pequeño, junto con los vínculos del Estado cubano con la academia latinoamericanista y la propia idea de delegación, insisto en esto, o sea, no es una sección temática que se reúnen los investigadores porque investigan el tema, sino que junto con eso que existe la idea de una delegación que va organizada desde la isla. En el caso de Claxo también se produce esto. Cuba es el país que tiene la cantidad mayor. En Claxo la representación no es personal, es por instituciones, es por centros. Y Cuba tiene un rol fundamental porque es el país con mayor, además de otra isla del Caribe, con mayor cantidad de centros per cápita de América Latina y que tiene la mayor cantidad de centros miembros en relación con su tamaño de población y de PIB, pero además tiene una característica fundamental, es decir, al ser la academia de todos los demás países, una academia plural, no todos los centros comparten las mismas prioridades administrativas, orientaciones ideológicas, perspectivas disciplinarias. Siendo que Cuba, el voto, por ejemplo, para elegir el secretario general es un voto de direcciones de centros, Cuba garantiza la posibilidad de que todos los centros de Cuba voten en bloque. De manera que, en la práctica, existe un poder bastante importante de decisión sobre quién puede ser el próximo secretario general, porque Cuba cuenta con un voto en bloque. En bloque. Bien. Voy avanzando porque creo que lo más rico puede ser la discusión posterior. Un colega, Pierre Gozán, un colega del Colegio de México, ha hecho un estudio muy bueno que tiene acceso además digital, se puede encontrar sobre la relación entre la instrumentalización política de la academia desde gobiernos de izquierda o identificados de izquierda y los efectos en la propia producción académica y en el acompañamiento de sujetos sociales emergentes. Y Pierre Gozán Además, está muy identificado con la agenda de los nuevos movimientos sociales, la perspectiva de Manuel Bernstein. Y lo que ha llamado la atención es cómo las restricciones a la autonomía simbólica, material, de la producción académica, inciden en la incapacidad de tener una reflexión crítica y de acompañar procesos sociales que contrapesen el poder del Estado. Y un poco lo que hemos podido percibir en el caso de la presencia del Chart Power y la articulación con los fenómenos de la tecnología política, en el caso cubano es que esto tiene un impacto decisivo sobre cómo se piensa la realidad cubana en parte de la academia latinoamericanista, es decir, que toma América Latina como enfoque, en la cual se discuten temas que para el caso cubano no se discuten o que se discuten de manera velada, movilizaciones sociales, autonomía de la sociedad civil, nuevas identidades, fenómenos de pobreza, violaciones de derechos humanos. Es decir, son temas que son caros a la academia latinoamericanista. Sin embargo, cuando se habla de abordar esos temas en el caso cubano, no se abordan o se abordan desde la perspectiva de la agenda del Estado cubano. Y aquí yo creo que es importante también entender cómo hay una especie, o se ha producido una especie de shift, de cambio de ciertas académicas, forma de entender la realidad política cubana en los últimos años. Es decir, hemos percibido que en los años de la normalización, ¿verdad? Parte de lo que se llamaría la tecnología política, los tecnólogos políticos vivieron horas doradas. Parecía que había un cambio de orientación en la política de Estados Unidos y que eso correspondía con ciertas reformas en curso en Cuba y que eso generaría cierta recuperación de derechos por parte de una apertura del Estado cubano. En el presente, en los últimos años, independientemente, es decir, como variable independiente de las acciones del gobierno de Trump hacia Cuba, se ha producido fenómenos de, por un lado, mayor apertura de información, mayor acceso a información, mayor debate público en Cuba, incluso en las estructuras limitadas del sistema político cubano, pero eso no ha cambiado de manera fundamental ni de jure el estatus de no autonomía académica, intelectual en el grueso de la academia insular, ni ha variado tampoco los esfuerzos por mantener una narrativa que es la narrativa del Estado en esos espacios intelectuales hegemonizados por ese discurso, ¿no? Y lo que tenemos, por ejemplo, es que, bueno, ahora mismo se mantiene en Cuba, o se ha producido en Cuba, un nuevo escenario limitado, parcial, emergente, fragmentado, que es el escenario que todas y todos conocemos, el llamado 27N, es decir, la mayor movilización por derechos artísticos y civiles en 60 años de régimen autocrático en Cuba, varios cientos de personas en un momento y un espacio físico, pero al mismo tiempo numerosas personas intelectuales vinculados muchos a las instituciones oficiales, científicos, sociales, discutiendo más allá de espacios meramente reivindicativos, gremiales, discutiendo sobre derechos, ciudadanía, nuevo tipo de sociedad, vigencia de la Constitución, y eso ha tenido como respuesta desde el campo revolucionario, y no hablo del campo estatal, porque aquí no es solo el Estado, son actores articulados con la agenda del Estado, reacciones que combinan tanto el Chart Power, es decir, ha habido declaraciones en redes, en algunas de estas redes intelectuales regionales, proyecciones de la tecnología política, es decir, mesas de debate, eventos académicos, pronunciamientos que hablan de democracia, de discusión, de participación, pero que no se refieren de manera clara, directa a lo que está pasando en el mismo momento y que genera además una propia dinámica. Es decir, hay un grupo de intelectuales cubanos, intelectuales cubanos y cubanas discutiendo, ciudadanos discutiendo los fenómenos del país en que viven y al mismo tiempo se producen debates que hablan de grandes categorías abstractas, pero no tocan a los sujetos reales que están en la discusión ahora mismo o subordinan eso y lo subordinan incluso en términos de presencia a la alerta o la denuncia del bloqueo embargo, ¿no? Y bueno, y todo eso coincide con una ofensiva tradicional en los medios masivos, incluso en declaraciones de las organizaciones llamadas de masas y profesionales, denunciando una nueva escalada de desestabilización, de cambio de régimen, en fin. Entonces, por un lado tenemos una sociedad más diversa, una sociedad más movilizada con todas las limitaciones del contexto, y por otro lado vemos que existe tanto proyección de sharp power, de tecnología política, como control ideológico tradicional, sharp power afuera, tecnología política in between y control ideológico dentro, que configura un sistema de influencia y control autocrático contra la discusión científica y académica, ¿no? Y bueno, lo que un poco planteamos es eso, ¿no? Una sociedad, una academia que lucha por sacudirse un corset político autoritario, debiera tener, o debiera encontrar al menos en parte de sus contrapartes, pues aliados, interfaces, contrapartes para discutir sobre la democratización del poder y del conocimiento, en vez de encontrar en ellos, digamos, correlatos de las agendas del Estado cubano. Y acá pongo algunas referencias, ¿verdad?, que de algunos trabajos recientes que tratan de explorar esta situación, tanto a nivel regional, a nivel más regional, es decir, qué pasa en América Latina, qué, digamos, propensión existe en América Latina, incluso si comparamos con las evoluciones parecidas en Europa, en la Europa de los años 70 y 80, es decir, cuando se recupera la democracia en Europa, eso coincide con el arribo del eurocomunismo, con una revisión de la izquierda, la aparición de los verdes y toda una rica discusión intelectual que refunda la izquierda y otras tradiciones, a la vez que redescubre la democracia en Europa del Sur y del Este. Y como en América Latina se recupera la democracia después de las dictaduras de seguridad nacional, pero hay elementos estructurales en la izquierda, en la cultura política y académica de izquierda que impiden, por ejemplo, una crítica al modelo del Estado cubano. Y bueno, hay una serie de elementos acá de textos que intentan apuntar a eso, y básicamente sería todo por ahora, y agradecerles la escucha y bueno, seguir atentos acá. Muchísimas gracias.
Fantástico. Fantástico. Siempre he tenido problemas de entender qué pasa con la ASCE. Una organización tan grande que en mi impresión, en mis 32 años en el Departamento del Estado, nunca la ASCE ha tenido ninguna influencia en la política de los Estados Unidos. Y parece que su explicación, su influencia de Cuba, era muy importante en esta falta de influencia. También me gustaría mucho sus comentarios sobre la importancia de los intelectuales dentro del país. Necesitan el apoyo, la ayuda de la gente de afuera. Ahora que esta es una función que ASCE sirve también. Bueno, nuestro segundo final va a una presentación por Larry Catá-Backer. What can I say about Larry? I mean, it's really hard to know what to say about Larry. I've known Larry, really got to know him in the last decade, where we both had very similar interests looking at the political culture of Cuba. And Larry mainly on ideology, and myself looking at some of the other issues as well. And I just love his work. You read his work, it's really quite a challenge, but it's worth every minute of it. And so I'm glad that he's here. Larry, of course, has also probably been one of the great inspirations for our virtual meetings. However, getting that aside, let me just quickly give you his background. He's a founding member of the Coalition for Peace and Ethics at the Pennsylvania State University and serves as the William Richard and Mary Eshelheim Faculty Scholar, professor of law and international law at Penn State. He teaches and researches in areas of globalization, including public and private law systems and emerging forms of data-driven governance, and has lectured on these topics in Austria, Europe, Latin America, and Europe. He's been a visiting scholar at universities, and I'm not going to mention them all. And he has written extensively on the emergence of 21st century Marxist-Leninist political and economic orders in Cuba and China. In that regard, let me say, I consider him the authority on Cuban ideology, at least among American scholars. Am I being enthusiastic enough, Larry? You told me to give you a punch.
I'm blushing. I'm blushing.
Good. That's good.
I can't live up to this hype.
Anyway, he's got a bunch of articles, but I'm not going to go into that. I've already given him enough praise. So now, this is not actually Larry's paper. We have the last paper is actually by Rafael Velázquez Pérez, who teaches international private law and international commercial law at the universities of Holguín in Cuba and Vigo in Spain. And he researches in the area of foreign direct investment. His book, Inversiones extranjeras sostenibles, un análisis alternativo de derecho internacional de inversiones enfocadas sobre Cuba, is apparently well known. I have not read it. I guess I should read it. Rafael was unable to make it today, so Larry's going to present his paper. Larry, it's all yours.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, this is, and I apologize, Rafael is in Holguín, and for all kinds of reasons, it was impossible for him to be able to attend this time. I'm sure we'll have him next time. This is a joint effort, putting our heads together. I will do my best by Rafael's part of the work, and we'll see where we go. And in a sense, I'm going to pick up where we left off. This is a very different kind of sharp power, and we'll see how it works. And we titled it "The EU to the Rescue of the Cuban Economy." That was certainly way up in the ideological chatter back in 2017 and 18, as the Americans were abandoning their increasingly strong embrace of Cuba, and there was the Europeans, the last light of liberal democratic markets-oriented world forces that would come to the rescue. And our focus is going to be on the political dialogue and cooperation agreement, the PDCA, and the state of Cuba-EU relations. And I'm going to start with templates. My thing, for those of you who know me, my thing is kind of templates, patterns, repetitions, and ideology, and then the way in which they kind of they sort themselves out in particular practices of people. And Cuba's external relations, after 70 or so years, the template has been very, very well developed and well understood. And it's a very simple one. There's 4 parts to it. It's driven primarily by opposition to and from the United States. This is one of the most effective dysfunctional relationships that we have had in the last several hundred years. We both love to hate each other and we hate to love each other. And that is the marker of our relationships. Cuba, more than the United States, we tend to be a forgetful partner in this dysfunctional relationship, except when it suits us. But still, the template for Cuba is always, the United States is either in the front or somewhere in the shadow. And second, it's based on a strong, though sometimes contentious, relationship with a principal patron. We start with the Soviet Union, which is a strong patron model. We move to Venezuela, which is a patron colleague partner model. And that and the opposition, the love-hate opposition to the United States basically forms the core of the template of Cuba's external relations. But there are 2 other components that then add sauce to this pattern that has marked Cuba certainly since the mid-60s. The third includes a secondary group of important partners, the anti-US bloc. It used to be the Bandung group in the 70s, the 60s, 70s, up to I guess they conked out in the 80 earlies. Now it's Iran, North Korea, China coming in and out, Russia coming in and out, and their positions in the secondary group will be very dynamic. and then a regional integration bloc, CARICOM, ALBA, big and then small, and then sympathetic states that come in and out from time to time. That's a third block, this important block of secondary partners. And then the fourth includes those states that serve a mediating role. And in that category, I include Vietnam. And now the point of all of this slide, I also include the European Union. Okay, so the European Union forms an incredibly important part of the Cuban external relations template, and it does that from my perspective, or our perspective, in the sense that it plays a mediating role. One in which they believe that they're exerting sharp power, one in which the Cubans believe that they are exploiting their own sharp power strategies in the economic area or through the politicization of economic relationships, which has marked the model almost from the beginning, right? So Europe has occupied this space between Cuba and the United States. Europe has occupied the space between Cuba and the United States almost from the start of the current political system in the early 60s. European policy has traditionally been driven by Spain, but other states also pursue objectives. And principally, we have the Germans, the French, the Italians, and the Dutch, not necessarily in that order. And it switches from time to time. And it's grounded in political calculation. One can sometimes tell the tenor of relationships between the Americans and the Europeans by looking at the state of European-Cuban relations. Cuba is kind of the friend that people use if we were in high school, and apparently in international relations, we're always in high school. This would be the friend who would be in the middle of a fight between two powerful players in high school politics. Right, so it reflects the state of EU-US relations and European engagement policies generally with developing states. Cuba is the friend that Europe will point to as it needs to modify its narrative of either helpfulness or strength or whatever with other developing states, and particularly with its own post-colonial friends. And it also reflects the substantial changes in European approaches to trade and international relations. There has been a fairly significant revolutionary, in a sense, transformation in the way Europe views things from the beginning of the 21st century to now, moving away, despite the rhetoric, moving away from notions of multilateralism and bilateralism to notions of multilateral internationalism. That is a significant change in that Europe moves outside of itself in terms of its own individual component parts and becomes a champion of a value-based internationalism, which is grounded in the products of international organizations, bound up in deep engagement with the right kinds of civil society organs, and then spilling out from the right organs, usually the apparatus in Geneva or the apparatus in Brussels, usually with a lot of German and French help. But there you go. So it's a European values-based internationalism, which is tied to the system of public international institutions. And that tends to guide increasingly European approaches, both to their American friends and to their dependencies. They don't like to use that term, but I'll use the appropriate term. They're downstream production chain partners in the ordering of their international relations. And its ideologies, of course, have moved decisively from transition-oriented, from the transition, that is a transition for Cuba-oriented EU common position in 1996, which mirrored the American position, to 2017 and the Political Dialogue and Cooperation Agreement, the PDCA, which is what we're going to talk about. The reason it's important is not just for Cuba. It's always fun to talk about Cuba, but this is a model. We're talking about two sets of rigid modeling here. The European model has now been, and especially the PDA, has been an instrumental template for understanding Europe's new set of cooperation and trade agreements with China, which was just announced at the end of December, and which eventually, probably this year, will be inked in some form that we will be able to see and criticize. I'm sorry, and laud. So my objectives are very simple. There's really two. One is I'm going to examine the PDCA in detail. I'm going to look at its ideology. I'm not going to bore you to death with it. It's over 80 paragraphs of highly technical provisions, and that will guarantee that most of you will find yourself in dreamland. But I'm going to try to sketch out where all of this is taking us. And then the second thing I'm going to review, well, everyone has gone to this tremendous trouble to construct these trade frameworks, these trade and cooperation frameworks. What has been the result? And I'm going to look at it from two perspectives. One, to what extent has it actually changed trade patterns between Cuba and the EU? Let me foreshadow by saying it hasn't. To an appreciable extent. But then the more interesting thing is to what extent has it played a role, and perhaps a decisive role, in the far more important aspect of the relationship between Cuba and the European Union, and that is the role of trade and aid, development cooperation and humanitarian aid, where in fact we have seen a far greater flow of goods, services, and the like. So that's what we're going to do. So we'll start with the ideologies of trade and the PDA. And here, of course, we mark the political reawakening of Europe, or at least its detachment from being the yes person to the American leadership on liberal democratic responses to Cuba. And it's, of course, it's the PDCA, which was negotiated during the last years of the Obama administration, was signed in 2016, approved by the European Parliament in July of 2017, overwhelmingly for Europe, and then ratified. And it consists of, and the interesting thing about the PDCA is that it's one of these agreements, and again, recall this when you begin thinking about the European-China agreements. It manages to satisfy two inconsistent positions simultaneously. For the EU, we're looking at PDCA as a tool for accompanying and supporting a process of change and modernization in Cuba. For the Cubans, it represents a normalization of its relationship in the way that the Cubans viewed their dialogue with the Obama administration in terms of normalization. No change, normalization where they should have been. For the Europeans. We move from transition from a Soviet Marxist-Leninist political and economic model to accompanying and supporting a kind of therapeutic approach with money and trade, a therapeutic approach towards what we now call modernization. That's the gist of this fairly complex framework within which the European Union and Cuba are going to shoehorn much of their trade. Right, and again, as I mentioned, there's a huge transition between 96 and 2016. Again, and I just brought some language out just so that you can see how this actually worked. This is paragraph 1 of the EU common position. The objective of the EU and its relation to Cuba is to encourage a process of transition to pluralist democracy with respect to human rights, blah, 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 no shock. That tends to be the American position, although we use less pretty words sometimes. And in 2017, the central basis of relationships is equality, reciprocity, mutual respect. This is language that is commonly used by socialist states to eventually, and you'll see this with the Chinese and the Chinese international position as well, which is basically back off, leave us alone, and let's see what kind of deals we can construct. And we'll each agree to disagree on what the principles we're all going to be moving forward are, including democratic principles, respect for human rights, fundamental freedoms, and the like. So that's what we're looking at, the ideological basis for this ideological document that is going to be manifested in trade and trade relationships. I'll just go very briefly through the agreement because, as I mentioned, this is it's a thick document. But still a very interesting one all the same. The fundamental theme is the one I've already raised, and it's a delicate balancing act. And you see this balancing all over the place in this document. Article 1 is a general reaffirmation of the commitment to multilateralism, respect for international law, the principles of the US Charter, equality, reciprocity, and the like. But the implementation of PDCA would be undertaken. Again, this is Article 1, Paragraph 3, in accordance with the respective constitutional principles, legal frameworks, legislation, norms, and regulations, as well as the applicable international instruments to which they are parties. And so on the one hand, we have an aggregation, a coming together, the traditional view of transition towards the apotheosis into the highest form of political organization, which is liberal democratic political organization in a markets economy. And at the same time, this is balanced by this notion that all of this is going to be undertaken with full respect to the constitutional provisions of the states, including Cuba, which in a sense then detaches Cuba or permits some space from what the Europeans have in mind in terms of conformity to these ideals. Cuba is not Poland. Poland can be punished. Cuba does not want to be in that position, nor will it ever be in the EU, but that's another story, right? And we see this again in the context of internationalism and human rights versus sovereignty. So you've got, again, in Article 1, Paragraph 5, a declaration of respect for the promotion of democratic principles, human rights, fundamental freedoms, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, core international human rights instruments in the ILO, which the Chinese have also agreed to sign. And at the same time, in the very next paragraph, you have both sides recognizing that all peoples have the right to freely determine their political systems and to freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Joinder separation in this agreement. Both states thinking that they have gotten a wedge into what it is that they want for the Cubans normalization, for the Europeans capacity building and sort of reforming barbarian state that hasn't quite gotten the word on what the appropriately apex system ought to look like. That's sort of a criticism that's not a suggestion of where my sympathies lie, but it is a suggestion about the ideological thrust of these provisions. And you all can decide which one you like best and then move forward with them. All right. And then, of course, all of this then carries over the 1996 EU common position, which is to carry out focused economic cooperation action in support of economic openings being implemented. That's ultimately the end game here. So the objectives are very simple. This is a trade template, which is a political template for trade to help Cuba update its economy and society through dialogue and cooperation. So you're going to update economy and society, dialogue and cooperation, which means you're going to talk and you're going to give money, the purpose of which is to update an economy and society. The Cubans will be more than happy to do that and to talk as long as they're happy with what updating the economy means. Mutual trade, the achievement of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which is interesting, and then to enhance regional trade in the Caribbean and Latin America, and then to promote Cuban ambitions with respect to CELAC, which the Americans despise, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. So another little nudge at the Americans here in creating the trade ideology with the Europeans. And again, the gist of this is, it's 2 words. The rest of it is just a lot more verbiage. Let's talk. That's what we're going to do. We're going to talk our way through trade, mutual cooperation and dialogue, but limited to state-to-state discussions. Marxist-Leninist states do not like talking to non-state actors, especially in the international arena. And Cuba has resisted including civil society in the process, even in the process of dialogue, to the point where it becomes difficult even to host side events at these meetings, which is the common way in which civil society will kind of act around state-to-state negotiations. The Americans have used it, the Latin Americans and the Europeans, of course, but not in this context. Human rights dialogue framework, which is Article 5, again, driven by both parties, no mutual agreement, no discussion about human rights, but we will all continue to advance it. Areas of cooperation and common projects. There's a whole list of them. This is what we're going to do. And again, you're asking yourself at this point, well, where's the trade part of this thing? Well, the trade part is what comes after or in the course of the framework within which we construct it. And here we're dealing with small arms, illicit trade in small arms. Cubans don't like a bunch of small arms surreptitiously running around the island. And other conventional weapons, disarmament and non-proliferation, anti-terrorism measures, international criminality, unilateral coercive measures, that is, the Europeans will agree to work with the Cubans against the US sanctions programs. That was actually a curious one because no one likes the embargo, but everyone likes global Magnitsky. And there's a question as to whether you separate the two out. The Europeans have, in fact, developed their own version of global Magnitsky, that is targeted sanctions. And so that remains an open agenda issue. Combating trafficking in persons and migrant smuggling, illicit drugs, race discrimination, xenophobia, and then sustainable development, most of these involving capacity building and aid. Again, the cooperation sectors are, as you can imagine, the Cubans, of course, focused on sustainable development and the development of their economy, the Europeans on human rights, governments, environmental sustainability, helping people, vulnerable people in society, and capacity building. And there are a number of areas that are identified. I'm not going to go through them, but you can see them. It's Articles 39 to 49 were the key areas that were going to be the focus of this. And then, of course, you've got the policy dialogue, which is going to be centered on information sharing, on harmonization of standards, and capacity building through best practice sharing, which is typically European, but that will be the basis on which we then can develop trade relationships, or through which we develop trade relationships with the Europeans, implemented through dialogue, and Article 18, paragraph 1A, technical and financial assistance. That's the doorway in developing Cuba's strategic concepts. Role of civil society. The Europeans had to work for this one. There's no place for them within the formal structures of these relationships, but paragraph 19E identifies civil society as an important element. But here again, note, civil society includes scientific, technical, cultural, artistic, sports, friendship, and solidarity association. This is the language of mass organizations in a Marxist-Leninist context, not civil society in a liberal democratic context. So Cuba essentially put their own language in, which then can be used to limit. When they tried to expand it, they expanded it to academia, think tanks, and the media. Regular civil society, lo disidente in Cuba, probably out formally, but will be the subject of the discussion through the frameworks for annual discussions between the Cubans and the Europeans outside of these parameters. Again, trade connected to human rights. Here we're again pushing two different views together. They got the Cubans to agree that it is their duty to protect all human rights and fundamental freedoms, regardless of the political, economic, or cultural systems, but they only do that bearing in mind the significance of national and regional particularities. Again, you join together, you take apart, and of course, all of them go back to the particular areas of interest in these relationships. It's the same ones I mentioned before. Article 29 to 39, I put a few of them up there as well, right? We finally get to the trade, investment, and modernization parts. This is Article 56. So you have to slug through a lot of this stuff to do this. Again, it's a promote and encourage model. Here focused on the development of Cuban cooperatives and enterprises. That will probably be changed in light of the economic changes and the economic reforms that have just been announced, although we don't know how that'll work. Taxation, a curious area is in the area of statistics and data production. The Europeans are going to be very interested in data protection and AI. The Cubans are not. Article 57 is likely to explode in the next couple of years. At the time it was negotiated, however, it was viewed as kind of information sharing. Pharma is big. That was a big concession to both Spain and to Cuba, whose relationships in pharma have been very deep. And then the latter part essentially outlines the model bit that would be acceptable between Cuba and then the member states of the Union. That's Articles 61 to 80. right? And all of this then gives birth to these intergovernmental structures, the establishment of a joint council, which is the space within which at the highest levels you talk about all of this stuff, and then the joint committee, which is actually the working group that meets annually. That's the good news. The bad news is that you never know what they're talking about because there's no transparency. They've met a couple times, the proceedings are opaque, and it has caused tremendous frustration both to the European Parliament. Sometimes we care about it when they're useful, sometimes we don't care when they're annoyance, but more importantly to European civil society, and that is likely going to bite soon. So where does that leave us with trade? I've been talking ideology, and that's the snooze for economists. Certainly, you all want to see numbers. So thank you, Rafael. We've got numbers for you. What has that done to trade between 2009, 2019? Actually, looking at the 2015 to 2019 numbers, you see no dynamic change. Again, a lot of imports, substantial decreases in products coming out of Cuba, and a substantial imbalance. That is then made clear when you break this out, and it's exactly what you'd expect. Agricultural and fishing products, industrial products from Cuba, and what the Europeans will provide to the Cubans are manufactured goods and food. And here you go. Again, key numbers. Not very good. The annual growth rate, in fact, has been decreasing, but none of this is a surprise. And for those of you who heard the economic panels earlier today, I'm not going to go through them again. It's no shock. Europe reflects the general trends in Cuba. It doesn't go against the grain. A lot of imbalance, a lot of hidden subsidies. The question is, where are the subsidies? The subsidies, of course, are within the measures, the aids, which is a no-no within Europe, but perhaps not out of Europe, the state aids provided by the member states in their and the union in relationship to Cuba, but it's basically stable or grown zero. It reflects again the patterns of trade and trade development in the world. So there's no aberration here. I'm not going to go through the numbers, but you can see that they're flat to negative. And again, here, the trade, imports and exports, food, live animals, beverage, and tobacco. Gary had mentioned rum and cigars, but rum and cigars are not to be underestimated, both in terms of their ideological as well as their financial power. There was that funny moment a couple of years ago when Cuba had thought that it might be able to erase its foreign debt to the Czech Republic by sending them a large quantity of rum. The Czechs politely refused and suggested that cash was better. So these things are working that way. And again, the flows in imbalance. I'm not going to take very much time. My PowerPoints are available to people if they want to see it. But effectively, the bottom line here is that we have gone through all of this process. We've developed this template. And from it, there is no appreciable difference other than in the relationship of the Europeans to the Americans and in trade and aid. And I'm going to end with this. There's just a couple of slides where we see some very interesting projections. And so the question is, well, where's all the money going to or coming from? Where do you have the equalization? What's in it for Europe? And what's in it for Europe is an effort to aid their way into trying to manage small changes in the way in which Cuba operates to the extent they can. And of course, they're very proud of this. This is from the Cuba, the last EU-Cuba fact sheet that was produced. Not a whole lot of money, but in terms of Cuba, perhaps substantial enough. Money is going into sustainable agriculture, food security, environmental renewable energy, and economic and social modernization. These are the public numbers. Add to this the numbers that are not seen, which are grants that are given to NGOs and civil society for use in Cuba as well. So the numbers will be somewhat higher. So you've got here something like 50 million euro in a year, maybe a little more. And of course, humanitarian aid, $100 million since 1994. If you put that out, that's not a whole lot of money a year, but this is the doorway through which you can do this. So at the end of the day, what do we have in terms of EU-Cuba trade? To some extent, the reality is not much change. The context has changed, the framework has changed, and that may produce significant potential changes later. The template has been very useful to Europe more in its relationships to the United States and China than in building its relationship with Cuba. And that at the end of the day, what seems to be the most important part of this is the use of trade, both to engage in political discussion, but much more important as the framework through which humanitarian capacity building aid, that is sharp power through money, flows from the European Union into Cuba. And with that, I'm done. Thank you very, very much. I'm sorry I went a little over.
You're forgiven. I've got a new mouse and doesn't respond when my old one did. Well, thank you, Larry. I think it's very good. I don't know how much that was yours and how much that was Rafael's, that presentation.
We're a team.
You're a team. Well, okay, very good. I've got to think about it, so I'm not going to go to. So let's go to questions and answers. I also would suggest members of the panel, if you want to ask each other questions and questions too, that's most appropriate. So there are a bunch of questions that people have already answered in written form. We might go back to them, or participants might feel free to go back to them if they wish. Unanswered is a comment by Silvia Pedraza, our former president, who said it's a wonderful paper and how much it gives us to think about. This is for Vadim. In the end, you note that the erosion of anti-Americanism in Cuba could open up possibilities for sustained economic change in Cuba via the government's utilization of the immigrants' remittances as capital for Cuban enterprises, as happened in other post-Soviet economies. Would you like to comment on that?
Thank you, Gary. First of all, I would like to say thanks to Sylvia for kind words. And it could be, regarding this question, could be an interesting simulation. What happens if? But we could see this evolution or transition of different politicians from anti-Western to pro-Western position during transition, post-communist transition. So it's a common evolution for many politicians, and Cuba cannot be something exceptional. But it's clear that it's necessary. It may happen under certain conditions. I just can mention some of them. First of all, they come back to the policy on the US side of detente. The second point, very important, real generational change of politicians on Cuba. And the third point, the third condition, the severity of economic crisis. These three, from my point of view, major factors can impact on evolution of political approach of Cuban elites, and part of Cuban elites toward the US and Cuban American community here. Thank you.
Okay, Roger De La Torre is a question for Larry. ¿Qué pasa con el Caribe y China in el Caribe? The new Cold War?
Is there going to be, thank you, Roger. This is a great question. Is there going to be a new Cold War in the Caribbean, or is this a continuation of the old Cold War, or is this just a marketplace? The Caribbean has always been in a very difficult spot since the end of the empire. It's no longer at the end of an old mercantilist production chain where Spain sucked a bunch of resources out of the New World to fill its coffers. And they've been left to their own devices in a lot of ways. They don't have the heft of Mexico. They don't have the context of Latin America. The Caribbean is in a very weird spot. So you do what you can. And right now, you effectively, and this is somewhat cynical, and I apologize for this, you play with the factors that you have. And right now you have a bunch of factors who may not view the Caribbean as a principal object, but who view it as tools that can be used to satisfy their objectives in larger games. And so in a sense, there's no Cold War so much in the Caribbean as there is an astuteness on the part of some of the Caribbean states that it is useful for them while they can. The Africans would do this for a while. They did it fairly well from time to time, to play the major players off each other or with them to the extent that they can then derive whatever it is necessary, one, to avoid a suffocating patronage. And the lesson of Cuba, both with their American friends and thereafter their Soviet friends, this is a lesson that looms large, right? To be able to develop some kind of benefit, but at the same time to remain, to have some kind of autonomy. Beyond that, you've got the family matters that go on in each of the Caribbean states, and those play out the way they play out, as well as in the inter-Caribbean region as well. So is there a Cold War in the Caribbean? I would say no. Is there a huge divide? Are we back in a sense in the 60s and 70s? I'd say no. And the cynic in me would suggest that ideology is useful here in the way that Armando talked about it, but really more as a tool for advantage, and advantage here includes autonomy. It's my best shot.
Okay, also for Larry, from Yvonne Grenier. Isn't the EU approach very similar to Canada's or vice versa?
Yeah, it is. It is. To some large extent, it is. There's much more dialogue. It's kind of it's funny, but it's not unexpected. There's more dialogue between Canadian leaderships and their European colleagues, of course, than their American colleagues, and certainly since 2016. Yeah, so the Europeans are not unique. What was different and useful for the Europeans is, they tend to have, again, I use the word heft. They tend to have more heft when they do things than the Canadians. Much as I love the Canadians, it will resonate more. But more importantly than that, to the extent that this sets up a template, it isn't Cuba that may be the ultimate object, but it's Europe's relationships with its former colonial partners in Africa and in South and Southeast Asia. And so this becomes a much more interesting problem. But it also reflects, and you were right to talk about Canada. It's not just a European thing. It is a thing among advanced liberal, democratic, market-oriented states, including the United States until 2016, and who knows what happens after 2021, to move towards this this pattern, this what I would call this cyclical dialogic pattern, in which you grind relationships down or through a constant set of engagements, capacity building, narrative engagements, fueled by, through, or against money, and the benefits that money will produce, either if you're a small country like Bangladesh, through opening and closing the spigot to beneficial trade deals so that your garment sector can continue to fuel enough money to keep revolution away, or through other means. And so, yeah, it's very similar to the Canadians, and it does represent a trend with respect to which even in the United States, there is a very strong faction of people who also buy into this. So another reason why the PDCA approach is worth careful study is that that tends to be a template that tends to be embraced by people who may have, certainly have a whole lot more power and influence than I do.
Okay, there's a question from Roger Betancourt. I think it's for Larry. Larry, can you see the question and answer from Roger? The answer question? Because I'm having understanding it's in Spanish and I get as far as the first two lines. Gracias. Coincide con mi impresión basada en una visión sobre la respuesta a COVID y los derechos humanos donde El Salvador y Venezuela fueron expuestos. Cuba no fue ni siquiera mencionada.
Yo creo que tiene que ver con mi presentación más bien.
Yes.
Sí. No sé si comento algo ahora, Gary, Larry.
Yes, please.
Básicamente, lo que vemos es un patrón de incluso de doble rasero respecto a crisis generadas en Latinoamérica de gobiernos de orientación no liberal. Por ejemplo, si uno compara el seguimiento que se le ha dado a la crisis venezolana, no digo que la magnitud de las movilizaciones, la existencia de una dualidad de poderes, es decir, no son semejantes el sistema político venezolano y el cubano, ni la sociedad civil venezolana ni la cubana, a pesar de, digamos, los nexos que existen. Pero más allá de eso, nosotros vemos, yo por lo menos he visto en el tratamiento en sectores de la academia latinoamericana y norteamericana, incluso en las mismas organizaciones, tratamientos diferenciados a Cuba y a Venezuela. Diferenciados en el modo, por ejemplo, en que se reconocen ciertos actores, en el que se analizan procesos, en la forma en que se emiten declaraciones, es decir, eso hay una diferencia importante. Entonces, yo creo que, pero justo por eso, lo que pasó en la coyuntura del finales del año pasado, es decir, el 27N, ¿no? Yo creo que abrí una ventana de oportunidad para la discusión, porque lo que sucedió con todas las limitaciones del caso es que, a pesar de una estructura limitada de oportunidades políticas, si usamos el término de Charles Tilly y Tarrow, hubo una manifestación ciudadana apelando a la institucionalidad vigente, a la legalidad vigente, incluso a la nueva constitución. Y esa novedad parece que para algunos sectores no ha sido tomada en cuenta. Bueno, por ejemplo, hay señales muy alentadoras. Hay un número reciente, creo que fue en NACLA, creo que hubo un número reciente muy interesante sobre esto. Ahí publicó la doctora Coco Fusco, William Leogrande, es decir, hay artículos muy interesantes ahí, creo que muy sólidos sobre esto. Pero, digo, lamentablemente creo que se sigue con una incapacidad para entender el caso cubano, que yo siempre planteo, hasta que me demuestren que antropológicamente los cubanos son distintos al resto de las poblaciones del mundo, cosa que sería extensible a la discusión con los árabes, con los chinos, es decir, no hay una excepcionalidad antropológica. Hay efectos de estructuras políticas, hay efectos de un modelo económico, pero no hay una excepcionalidad. Y sin embargo, es tratado como excepcionalidad el caso cubano, es decir, y a eso un poco apunta la discusión, ¿no? Efectivamente, yo he estado en discusiones donde se analizan los casos de América Latina, porque yo trabajo con países de América Latina, y el caso cubano o se toma la posición oficial, difundida desde las instituciones, incluso académicas cubanas, o no se toca. Y yo creo que es hora de ir cambiando eso. Por ahí alguien me preguntaba, por ejemplo, sobre diálogo interamericano. Yo recuerdo que diálogo interamericano, aunque aclaré que no es uno de los casos de estudio de mi investigación reciente, pero sí, digamos, he seguido, he visto, he participado, una perspectiva sólida, muy interesante. Pero si uno analiza los eventos, sobre todo que se dieron cuando la normalización de Obama había mucho énfasis en dos aristas fundamentales: la reforma económica y la noción de empowerment, que sería una noción a discutir, es decir, la idea de que la apertura económica genera derechos, y eso sería una noción a discutir porque esos derechos están centrados sobre todo en sectores urbanos, blancos, de clase media, ¿no? Entonces, lo cual a mí me genera siempre, me llama la atención que los sujetos que normalmente la izquierda académica reivindica no están entre los empoderados en Cuba, pero bueno, no importa. Y el otro tema que se discutía es que la visión de cambios políticos, ustedes recordarán, queridas y queridos colegas, estaba muy centrado en la idea de oposición leal, Cuba posible y todo eso. Bueno, pero es que Cuba posible, como proyecto, que es uno de los proyectos más interesantes intelectuales y políticos de los últimos años, fue desaparecido por la presión oficial. Y yo lo que decía, bueno, ahora sería el momento en que las contrapartes, ¿verdad?, de esas instituciones que presentaron estos esfuerzos como esfuerzos moderados, reformistas, que no nos generaban mucho ruido, del cambio que queríamos, bueno, este es el momento de hacer balance de qué pasó con eso. Y si eso que pasó fue por digamos, por un resultado de la presión de la administración Trump, que es un argumento que se ha utilizado, que empíricamente yo discutiría, o fue por una contrarreforma desde el propio Estado. Bueno, pero ya que el actor moderado desaparece, y desaparece porque el Estado lo desaparece, ahora no se discuta eso. ¿Me explico? Entonces yo creo que son las discusiones que tenemos que dar un poco para entender cómo el sharp power o la tecnología política se acomoda y es acomodada en espacios de la academia que mencionaba Larry, interamericana, y son nuestros colegas. Y nosotros justificamos, legitimamos la supresión de derechos y espacios a ellos de los que nosotros disfrutamos. Entonces, a mí me parece que hay una regla básica de la condición intelectual y del espacio académico abierto que se incumple. Pudiera citar otros ejemplos, por ejemplo, sería interesante hacer una comparación entre las posturas de Wola, por ejemplo, respecto a Cuba y respecto a Venezuela. Les invito a que busquen el caso, ¿no? Una misma organización con un perfil interesante de trabajo y con posturas, digamos, diferenciadas. Entonces, creo que hay mucho por ahí para discutir todavía, ¿no?
Thank you. There's some questions have already been answered in a written form, but I think it'd be useful quickly to go through them again for those who haven't seen the written answers. For Yuri, this is from Roger Betancourt again. You discussed the various accords that have been signed between China and Cuba. And his question is, how many of these accords have been implemented, and by how much in terms of the personal goods or services and capital actually exchanged or created?
Yeah, well, in this regard, I'm concerned about the Cuban political position, because it's always like there is the intention, but not the will. So because it's different. It's always when Cuba tried to be open to the foreign investment, but never get to the end of the project. So because they have the intention, but not the will. So that have made that foreign investor don't take seriously the possibility to invest in Cuba. So that is happening in the energy field. So with China, Cuba have been a little more open, but in some point they never finish their projects. So that is it's a point of view from inside, but when you think a little bit about it, you will see that there is something that there is not really the will to finish that project. That's why in Cuba, with the possibility to make a lot of projects in the energy field, none of them have been finished.
Well, that answers the question from Patrick Hem as well, so I don't think to continue. I think that's all the questions that have come up so far. So does any of the participants have like any questions or comments to each other?
I got
Yeah.
a question for Vadim. All right, Vadim, I loved your presentation. I thought it was just marvelous. But it made me think, it's points of no return don't necessarily have a particular endpoint. We tend to view it as going in one direction. So in Cuba, you see the San Isidro movement and you go, well, inevitably you reach a point of no return, which means that you're on your way to the establishment of some kind of liberal democratic state, however you define that. But would it also be possible to agree that there's a point of no return, but that the trajectory is actually in the opposite direction, that what it'll do is not create a movement towards glasnost, but towards Tiananmen?
Gentlemen. Yes, it's possible, and it's a huge topic, especially now when we see this growing strength of authoritarianism around the world. So it's, again, we can't exclude this option, but nevertheless, we are optimists in trying to see the positive outcomes of this movement. And Larry, I also would like to say that your presentation was absolutely great and interesting, but let me express my opinion that relations between EU and post-Soviet republics, let alone Eastern European countries, still uncomparable what EU has with Cuba right now. So we can find some similar features, but the scale, the significance of these relations for European and Eurasian countries are much more valuable and visible than what we have now between EU and Cuba. And maybe, Gary, if you permit me one more comment regarding another question I received, if Russia can obstruct Cuban-American relations in case new detente happened. I would like to say that there are different instruments in the hands of Kremlin, and for sure, and it can use not only debt issues, as the author of Question, Maria, I believe, mentioned, but different instruments, and not only stick, but also carrots, particularly oil delivery, because Russian politicians mentioned different times and promised to increase delivery of Russian oil to Cuba. It can be also very significant instrument in bilateral relations. But in general, the Russian policy towards Cuba will depend on US-Russia relations. It's a part of big puzzle and big geopolitical game. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'd like to add to that. My own view, you know, I served in the U.S. interest section in Havana, and I'm somewhat sensitive to what happened to our diplomats there. More than a little bit sensitive, my bad. It's always occurred, I've always believed that the obvious power that had an influence, that had a need or an incentive to attack our diplomats had to be Putin. This was a period in which the Obama administration was trying to improve relations with Cuba. It was typical, I think, of Putin to try to make difficulties for us. And this was a great way to do it. It basically froze the relationship. And I think it's going to be very hard to put back together on a diplomatic scale. How do you have relations with a country when diplomats can't feel secure? So I don't have any evidence of that. But I think that's the best explanation for what happened to our diplomats. And my guess is the Cubans did not know about it ahead of time, but I'm sure they do now, and they haven't been willing to confront that, at least not to us. Anybody else? Nobody's gonna take me up on that? Okay. Well, listen, it was a great session. We're only 3 minutes over time. I can't believe it. I enjoyed every bit of it. I'm going to want to read some more papers. Armando's, especially yours, because I must say the Spanish got to me a little bit. And well, everybody's. I'd like to read everybody's papers. So please send them to me when you get a chance. And I'll be looking for them on our. We're hoping that all our papers will be online by the end of the month, right, Larry? And people will be able to see them. You can probably get them through the ASCE site and also the site, Larry's site. So thank you, everybody. We start again tomorrow morning at 10, I believe.
Right.
On U.S.-Cuban relations. I'm going to be speaking on that one. And hopefully you'll find that interesting as well. Have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you very much, Gary.
See you tomorrow.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.